All right, so we're diving deep into the F1 sprint qualifying in Shanghai. Friday, March 21st, 2025. You guys sent in a ton of reports, and it's our job to sort through it all. We're going to pick out the biggest moments, the surprises, and try to figure out what it all means for the actual sprint race. Lots to cover, mainly focusing on those qualifying results and what everyone's saying about them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, looking at these reports, the first thing that really stands out is just how unexpected the top of the timesheets was. Before the session, everyone was talking about McLaren, carrying that momentum from Australia, but, well, things didn't exactly go according to plan, did they?
Definitely not. And the biggest shocker has got to be Lewis Hamilton grabbing pole position for the sprint race, his first pole with Ferrari. It seems like every report is calling it a total surprise. Like, completely opposite of what all the, the ordenadores y simulaciones were predicting. Those computers and simulations had McLaren as the clear favorites. What do you think allowed Ferrari and Hamilton to pull this off?
Well, that's the big question, right? The reports mentioned some grandes cambios, some big changes to the car since that tough race in Australia. And Hamilton himself said that a super strong first sector was key to his pole lap. So maybe Ferrari found some extra aerodynamic efficiency, especially on the long straights in Shanghai. Perhaps their setup changes were really dialed in for this specific track, something the simulations might have missed.
It does sound like Hamilton squeezed every ounce of performance out of that car, and the margins were ridiculously tight. Only 0.018 seconds between him and Max Verstappen, and just 0.080 seconds back to Oscar Piastri in third. I mean, that tiny gap really shows how intense the competition is at the front. And some of the descriptions in these reports are pretty wild. One called Hamilton's lap a filo de locura y fe, a lap of madness and faith, and another one called it a vuelta final mágica de la antaño, a magical final lap like back in the old days. What does that kind of language tell us?
It really emphasizes the human element. All the fancy data can give you probabilities, but ultimately it comes down to the driver, their skill, their determination, and maybe even a bit of risk-taking in that crucial moment can completely change the game. And comparing it to some of his legendary laps from the past, it sounds like Hamilton was really at his best.
We've even got some quotes from Hamilton himself after qualifying. He sounds, well, surprised, but also relieved. He talked about the Australian race being a disaster and how those grandes cambios unlocked more performance. He specifically mentioned that strong first sector. Seems like those last-minute tweaks really worked for this shorter qualifying format. How much do you think a qualifying performance like this will change their strategy for the sprint race?
It's definitely a huge morale boost to be starting from pole. But the sprint race throws in some different challenges. The setup that gives you ultimate one-lap speed might not be the best for a longer stint, especially when you have to manage the tires. However, having that strong first sector could still be a big advantage. If Hamilton can build an early lead, he can control the race from the front. It'll be interesting to see if Ferrari's found that sweet spot, a setup that works for both qualifying and race pace.
Totally. We're also getting a glimpse into how the Ferrari team is reacting. Marc Gené over on DSEN said he was, and I quote, "Más que feliz estoy aliviado," which basically means more than happy, I'm relieved. He said that this result lets the team trabajar con más tranquilidad, meaning work more calmly no matter what happens in the sprint race. That sense of relief probably says a lot about the pressure that comes with being on a top team, especially with someone like Hamilton joining the ranks. What do you make of the team's reaction?
Well, for a team like Ferrari, especially after a start to the season that wasn't exactly spectacular, getting a result like this early on in their partnership with Hamilton is huge. It builds confidence, validates their car development decisions, and lets them approach the rest of the weekend and even the next few races with a more optimistic outlook.
Fred Vasseur, also on DZN, agreed that it was a good moment for the team, but he quickly brought everyone back down to earth, reminding them that points are scored on Sunday and that consistency is key. He even pointed out how Hamilton's performance varied across the three qualifying segments. He was fastest in SQ1, then struggled in SQ2, only to bounce back for the top spot in SQ3. What do you think caused that inconsistency?
Vasseur is definitely being pragmatic, as you'd expect from a team principal. The inconsistency Hamilton showed could indicate that they haven't quite nailed that perfect setup window for all conditions and tire compounds. They found the sweet spot for that final SQ3 run, but those earlier struggles suggest there's still some fine-tuning needed to make sure they can hit that peak performance more consistently throughout the weekend.
Okay, now let's shift gears and talk about McLaren. Coming into this event, they were the favorites, especially after Lando Norris's win in Australia. Everyone was saying they had a really strong car.
Exactly, and that's why Hamilton's pole is so significant. If everyone thought McLaren had the edge, their performance in qualifying, while not a total disaster, definitely raises some questions. They didn't quite live up to those high expectations.
Yeah, Oscar Piastri did manage to qualify third, which is a decent result, but his teammate Lando Norris had a much tougher time. He made some uncharacteristic errors on his final flying laps in SQ3 and ended up 6th. One report even said he made 2 big mistakes and was hundiendos, basically sinking down the order. What do you think went wrong for Norris?
Tough to say without seeing their data and driver feedback, but the report mentions 2 distinct errors. It could be that he pushed a little too hard trying to match Hamilton's time, or maybe the car became harder to handle as the track conditions changed. Sometimes the pressure of being the favorite can lead to drivers overdriving.
The difference between the 2 McLaren drivers in SQ3 was pretty big at one point. Reports say Piastri was a whole 0.464 seconds ahead of Norris earlier in the session. That kind of gap between teammates in identical cars usually means either a driver error, like we suspect with Norris, or maybe they had different car setups.
For sure. Even though they have the same basic car, drivers often tweak their setups to fit their driving style. It's possible Piastri's setup worked better as the track evolved, or maybe he just had a cleaner, more consistent lap when it counted.
Norris seems to be aware of his struggles too. One source says his mistakes were reminiscent of los enormes fallos del año pasado, the huge errors he made last year. That's a pretty harsh self-assessment. It seems like he knows he missed a chance here.
It's interesting that he's being so honest about it. It shows self-awareness and maybe some frustration with repeating past mistakes. It'll be important for him to regroup and put this behind him, especially with the sprint race and main Grand Prix qualifying coming up.
Okay, let's move on to some Ferrari team dynamic. One report mentions a really interesting detail. It says that the team actually told Charles Leclerc to swap track positions with Hamilton early in the session to give Hamilton a bit of an advantage. What are the implications of a team order like that in qualifying?
Team orders in qualifying are always tricky. The idea is usually to give one driver a better shot at a top result, maybe by giving them a tow or a clear track. But it can create tension if the other driver feels like they're being treated unfairly, especially early in the season.
And apparently this didn't sit well with Leclerc, who finished 4th, about 2/10 behind Hamilton. The report even calls it Hamilton winning his first battle against Leclerc at Ferrari, at least on a single lap. It adds another layer to their dynamic as teammates, doesn't it? Even though Leclerc's pace was consistently close to Hamilton's, that feeling of being told to help out the other driver can have a psychological impact.
Absolutely. Even if the performance difference was tiny, being asked to play a supporting role, especially in the super competitive world of F1, can be tough for a driver who wants to win the championship. It'll be interesting to see how their relationship develops as the season goes on.
These reports also give us some snippets about the midfield teams, Alpine, Haas, and Sauber. The general consensus is that while they can put in a good lap time every now and then, their overall performance, and especially their consistency, is still behind the front-runners and even some of the other midfield contenders. What does that tell us about the pecking order right now?
It kind of reinforces the existing hierarchy. These teams might have improved in certain areas, allowing them to challenge the top teams occasionally, but to maintain that performance throughout qualifying and, even more importantly, during a race, you need a really well-rounded car. Their occasional bursts of speed show potential, but consistency is still their biggest hurdle. Like, look at Alpine. They had decent pace in SQ1, showing some raw speed, but they couldn't keep it up in the later segments.
Let's talk about the Spanish drivers, Fernando Alonso and Carlos Sainz. They had a pretty mixed bag in Shanghai. Alonso, driving for AstonMartin, qualified 11th, just missing out on SQ3 by a tiny 0.021 seconds. But one report says the Aston Martin seemed to be performing better at this track than in previous races. What are your thoughts on Alonso's performance?
Missing out on SQ3 by such a small margin is always frustrating for a driver like Alonso, but if the Aston Martin has genuinely improved in Shanghai, like the report suggests, starting 11th might actually give him more strategic options for the sprint race and the main Grand Prix. He's definitely got the experience to turn that improved pace into points, even starting outside the top 10.
Yeah, his teammate Lance Stroll did make it into SQ3 qualifying 10th. So it seems like the Shanghai circuit, or maybe some specific upgrades Aston Martin brought, is working for at least one of their drivers. That difference between teammates often comes down to small setup tweaks and how each driver adapts to the track.
Exactly. Drivers are very particular about car balance and handling. What works for one might not work for the other. The Aston Martin engineers will definitely be poring over the data to figure out why Stroll found that extra bit of performance in qualifying.
For Carlos Sainz, driving for Ferrari, it was a much tougher session. He ended up 13th on the grid, complaining about problems with the car's balance in SQ2. He even said his seat was moving around in the cockpit because of the bumps on the track. That sounds incredibly distracting. How much would something like that affect a driver's performance?
A physical distraction like a moving seat in an F1 car is a nightmare. It makes it really hard for the driver to feel connected to the car and push it to the limit. At those speeds, with such small margins, any instability or unwanted movement can really throw a driver off. It's no wonder Sainz was frustrated.
One report says his start to the season with Ferrari hasn't been the dream start everyone was expecting after a promising preseason. It seems like he struggled to get the most out of the soft tires in qualifying, which is a big problem in F1 these days when Saturday's performance has such a huge impact on the rest of the weekend. Why is getting those soft tires to work so crucial in qualifying?
The softest tires are designed to give you maximum grip for a short time, so they're the go-to for setting the fastest lap times in qualifying. If a driver can't get those tires up to temperature and working properly, they're at a huge disadvantage compared to those who can. It could be a setup issue, not generating enough heat in the tires, or even the driver's style not being suited to the soft compound on this particular track.
All right, let's wrap up with some other notable performances and incidents from the session. Yuki Tsunoda and the RB had a solid run, qualifying 8th. That puts him ahead of Alex Albon in the Williams and his own teammate, Lance Stroll. One of the news articles even called Williams a positive surprise, although we don't have all the details on that. It's always great to see those midfield teams exceeding expectations.
Definitely. For teams like RB and Williams, consistently breaking into the top 10 in qualifying shows real progress with their cars and great driving from their drivers. It makes the midfield battle much more unpredictable and exciting.
On the flip side, Liam Lawson had a really tough time. Ending up last, he was struggling with a very nervous Red Bull, according to the reports. That's a stark contrast to his teammate Verstappen's performance, and it suggests he's having trouble adapting to the car's setup or handling on this track. A nervous car can be really hard to drive consistently and quickly.
A nervous car usually means it's lacking stability, especially under braking and into corners. That really hurts a driver's confidence and makes it super difficult to push the car to its limits. Lawson and his engineers need to figure out what's causing that instability before the sprint race if they want to improve the car's handling.
There was also an incident during SQ1 between Lance Stroll and Ollie Beerman. Stroll was judged to have impeded Beerman. Those incidents are always closely examined by the stewards, and sometimes they result in penalties. Definitely something to watch out for as we head into the races. Bucking another driver, especially in the tight confines of qualifying, can have a big impact on their final grid position.
Absolutely. In qualifying, every fraction of a second matters. Impeding another driver can ruin their lap and even lead to grid penalties, affecting both the sprint race and the main Grand Prix starting positions.
And a little bit of history repeating itself. Lewis Hamilton had a moment in free practice 1 where he went wide at the pit lane entry. Longtime F1 fans will remember his famous incident there back in 2007. The good news this time is that the gravel track has been replaced with asphalt, so he could rejoin the track without any major issues. The official F1 social media even compared the two incidents. It's funny how certain moments and locations become part of F1 lore, isn't it?
It really is. Those little connections to the past add an extra layer of interest for the fans and remind us of the sport's rich history. The fact that it played out so differently this time shows how much safety and track design have evolved over the years.
So from what we've seen in these reports, this sprint qualifying session in China has thrown up some surprises, with Hamilton's unexpected pole for Ferrari being the biggest talking point. The session showed us just how close the competition is at the front, exposed some surprising errors from McLaren, and highlighted the contrasting fortunes of the two Ferrari drivers. And with the close gaps we're seeing in the midfield, it looks like we're in for a very exciting sprint race.
Definitely. The sprint qualifying format, with its shorter length and specific tire rules, can sometimes mix things up compared to the traditional qualifying session. It keeps things interesting.
The fact that Hamilton, after what was described as a tough start to his time at Ferrari, was able to pull out such an amazing lap shows the potential of the SF25 and his own driving talent. But the sprint race is a whole different challenge, and with Verstappen and Piastri so close behind, they'll be pushing him all the way. And for the Spanish drivers, Alonso and SAINZ, they've got their work cut out for them if they want to score points from where they're starting.
Exactly. Hamilton's pole is a great story, but turning that into a good result in the sprint race with such tough competition will be a real test for both him and the team. And for Alonso and SAINZ, moving up the order will be crucial if they want to pick up some valuable championship points.
So this deep dive has given you a good overview of the sprint qualifying results from Shanghai and the key things to watch out for in the sprint race. It definitely raises some questions about McLaren's consistency, what's going on within Ferrari, and whether Hamilton can convert that pole into a top result. For all the latest updates and analysis after the sprint race and the main Grand Prix, be sure to check out F1 blogs.
And before we wrap up, here's something to think about. With more and more of these sprint race weekends in F1, how are teams changing their strategies for the whole Grand Prix weekend? Does a strong performance in sprint qualifying change how they approach the main qualifying session and the race on Sunday? It's a fascinating strategic element to keep an eye on as the season progresses. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to F1 blogs for all the latest coverage.